She was just a homeless woman begging for food outside the grocery store, until she whispered those 4 shocking words that made Karoline Leavitt freeze in her tracks. What happened next would change both their lives forever. This is the power of kindness you won't believe. The bitter winter wind roared through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago like an angry beast, its icy breath turning every exposed patch of skin into numb, tingling flesh. Pedestrians moved like ghosts through the twilight, their shoulders hunched against the relentless cold, their breath forming fleeting clouds of vapor that disappeared as quickly as their fleeting glances at the homeless figures huddled in doorways. The city's usual symphony of honking taxis and chattering crowds was muted under a thick blanket of frigid air that seemed to leach the very life from the streets. Karoline Leavitt, wrapped in a designer wool coat that offered more style than warmth, navigated the crowded sidewalk with the practiced ease of someone who knew these streets intimately. Her mind was already 3 blocks ahead, mentally rehearsing her presentation for the education reform meeting that would determine funding for dozens of inner-city schools. The cold bit at her cheeks, turning them rosy, but she barely noticed. Until a voice, cracked with exhaustion and something deeper, something like broken hope, sliced through her thoughts like shards of glass. "Please, just a little help." The words were barely audible over the wind, yet they carried an emotional weight that made Karoline's expensive leather boots suddenly root to the frozen pavement. She turned slowly, her cashmere-gloved hand tightening, unconsciously around the strap of her Italian leather briefcase, and there, wedged between a dumpster and the grocery store's brick wall, sat a woman who looked like the embodiment of urban despair. Her threadbare coat might have once been blue, but now it was a patchwork of stains and repairs, the stuffing leaking from multiple seams like wounds that refused to heal. The paper cup in her trembling hands held perhaps 75 cents in assorted change, but it was the woman's eyes, sunken yet strangely alert, exhausted yet burning with some unnameable emotion, that truly captured Karoline's attention. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, yet somehow still clung to the thinnest thread of hope. Karoline's first instinct was to move on. She had important people waiting, a schedule packed with meetings that would shape education policy for thousands of children. Her fingers twitched toward the $20 bill in her wallet, already composing the polite but distant words she would murmur as she dropped it in the cup and continued on her way. But something, perhaps the way the woman's cracked lips formed the words with quiet dignity, or how her spine remained straight despite her obvious exhaustion, made Karoline hesitate. As she reached into her purse, the woman's hand shot out. With surprising speed, her bony fingers closing around Karoline's wrist with a grip that belied her frail appearance. The contact was electric, sending an unexpected jolt through Karoline's body, as if this moment had been fated somehow, written in the stars long before either of them had taken their first breath. "They took my daughter." 4 simple words, delivered. In a voice raw with 2 years of unanswered prayers, shattered Karoline's carefully constructed world of policy meetings and fundraising galas. The grocery store entrance, the passing crowds, even the biting cold, all faded into insignificance as those words hung between them like a physical thing. Karoline's breath caught in her throat, her pulse suddenly pounding so loudly she wondered if the woman could hear it. This wasn't just another panhandler's plea for spare change. This was a mother's cry from the depths of hell itself, a scream into the void that had gone unanswered for far too long. The woman's eyes, now that Karoline looked closely, held a story that no human being should ever have to tell, a story of sleepless nights and endless days, of hope slowly curdling into desperation. Against every rational thought telling her to walk away, against the voice of practicality reminding her of her packed schedule and professional obligations, Karoline found herself sinking into a crouch, her expensive coat brushing the filthy pavement as she brought herself eye level with the trembling woman. The cold seeped through the fine wool of her trousers, but she barely registered it. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a detached part of herself marveled at this uncharacteristic behavior. The Karoline Leavitt known to the public didn't stop for homeless women, didn't risk her designer clothes on dirty sidewalks, didn't involve herself in personal tragedies. But the Karoline Leavitt in this moment couldn't have walked away if her life depended on it. And so Miriam, her name was Miriam, she had been a third-grade teacher before her world ended, began to speak, her voice cracking like dry parchment, as she unfolded a horror story that belonged in nightmares, not real life. 2 years ago, her 9-year-old daughter Lila had left school at 3:15 p.m., just like every other day. She should have been home by 3:45, but 4 hours came and went with no sign of her. By 4:30, Miriam was calling every parent in Lila's class. By 5, she was at the police station, where they told her to wait. Children wandered off all the time, they said. She'd probably just gone to a friend's house without telling anyone. By midnight, when the officers finally took her seriously, it was already too late. The security camera footage from a nearby bodega showed Lila being pulled into a van by a man in a hoodie, her small face a mask of terror before the door slammed shut. That was the last time Miriam had seen her daughter. Karoline listened, her stomach twisting into ever tighter knots with each devastating detail. The police investigation had stalled within weeks. No leads, no witnesses, no ransom demands. Miriam had sold everything she owned to hire a private investigator who took her money and disappeared. She'd lost her job because she couldn't focus on teaching when her child was missing. The shelters wouldn't take her because she spent all night walking the streets, searching faces in crowds, following whispers of trafficking rings. She'd become one of Chicago's invisible people, just another nameless figure begging for change. Because what else was there to do when the world had stopped looking for your child? Karoline's hands clenched into fists so tight her manicured nails bit into her palms. This wasn't right. This wasn't acceptable in any version of the world she wanted to live in. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside her. Some barrier between her public persona and her private self crumbling away. The decision came to her fully formed, as if it had always been inevitable. "I'm going to help you," she said, her voice low but vibrating with conviction. "And we're going to find your daughter." What followed was a blur of activity that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew Karoline only as the polished education advocate from television interviews and charity galas. She called in favors from investigative journalists who owed her for past collaborations. She reached out to former FBI agents she'd met through her nonprofit work. She spent nights hunched over her laptop in a cheap motel room with Miriam, scouring missing persons databases and underground forums where such horrors were sometimes discussed. The Karoline who appeared at daytime meetings was all professionalism and poise, but the Karoline who emerged after dark was something else entirely, a woman possessed, driven by a fury that burned hotter with each dead end they encountered. Then, 3 weeks into their desperate search, came the breakthrough. A tip from an anonymous source about a warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. The details were vague, deliberately so, but the urgency in the informant's voice had been unmistakable. Karoline didn't hesitate. She called in every favor she had left, assembling a ragtag team of off-duty cops, private security, and a journalist with a camera, because if this went wrong, she wanted someone to document it. That night, under the cover of a snowstorm that blanketed the city in eerie silence, they moved in. The raid was nothing like the clean, choreographed operations Karoline had seen in police procedurals. It was chaos incarnate, the sickening crunch of the crowbar breaking the lock, the shouts of surprise from inside, the acrid smell of sweat and fear that hit them like a physical blow when they burst through the door. The warehouse was a maze of dimly lit corridors and padlocked rooms, each one potentially holding unspeakable horrors. Karoline's heart pounded so violently, She feared it might burst from her chest as they moved deeper into the building, her flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Then, a sound. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of the old building. A child's whimper. Karoline's blood turned to ice in her veins as she followed the sound to a door secured with multiple locks. The moment it gave way under their combined strength would be etched in her memory forever. The sight of small, dirty faces blinking up at them in the sudden light. The smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The way one particular little girl, thinner than she should be, her hair matted, but with Miriam's eyes, looked up with an expression that wasn't hope yet, but might become hope if they moved quickly enough. The reunion between Miriam and Leela happened in the back of an ambulance, under the flashing red lights that painted the snow crimson. Miriam's knees gave out the moment she saw her daughter, her entire body convulsing with sobs as she gathered the trembling girl into her arms. Leila clung to her mother like a drowning person to a lifeline, her small fingers digging into Miriam's threadbare coat as if she feared they might be torn apart again. Karoline stood back, her own cheeks wet with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding, watching as 2 years of unimaginable pain were washed away in that single, perfect moment of reunion. But even as the ambulance doors closed on mother and daughter, Karoline knew this wasn't the end. The other girls in that warehouse, 6 of them, ranging in age from 8 to 14, had families somewhere, parents who might still be searching, or who might have given up hope entirely. And if this was happening here, in her city, how many other warehouses like it existed? How many other Lees were still waiting in the dark? The realization settled over her like a heavy cloak. She couldn't unsee what she'd seen tonight, couldn't pretend this wasn't her fight anymore. As dawn broke over Chicago, painting the snow-covered streets in pale gold light, Karoline made a silent promise to herself and to all the missing children whose faces she didn't yet know. This was just the beginning. She would use every resource at her disposal, every connection she'd cultivated through years of philanthropy, to shine a light into these shadows. Because no mother should have to become a ghost on the streets, whispering her pain to strangers, in the hope that one of them might finally listen. Now we turn to you, our readers. Have you ever encountered a moment that changed everything? A single encounter that rewrote your understanding of the world? Share your stories in the comments below, because sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with ordinary people refusing to look away. And if this story moved you, please consider sharing it. You never know who might need to hear this. Message today. Want to join us in uncovering more stories of hope and humanity? Click subscribe to ensure you never miss our latest investigations into the moments that remind us what truly matters.